recording. So today's discussion is about our last homework assignment. And so let's take a look. So a lot of the stuff at the beginning, and there are 5 practice problems that are related to the 10 homework problems. And so that shouldn't, cause you all any difficulty. But the general idea is so we have all of these different ways in which industries can be structured to supply goods and services. And the main one is competition. And I believe that probably most economists that you would talk to would say that competition is a default assumption. And that means that we look at most industries and we assume that they're competitive. But when you kind of, look underneath the hood a little bit more closely, then you find out that generally, there are some important differences. Even though things might initially seem competitive, they really aren't. And it's because to be truly competitive, among other things, you need to be having what we call a homogeneous or a uniform good that's being traded in the industry. And for the good to be homogeneous or homogeneous or uniform, it means that no matter who produces it, it has to be substantially similar to what someone else is producing. And so the consumers are just going to buy on the basis of price. So one of the key distinctions when you start to talk about these other forms of industrial organization or organizing industries, their features, you'll notice pretty quickly that if you get outside of agricultural commodities, so if you're not talking about apples, right, or cucumbers, cucumbers by Farmer John are the same as the cucumbers from Farmer Susie. So people normally, when they're talking about homogeneous goods, they'll say, agricultural goods are a good example because it doesn't matter who produces them. You're just looking for whatever you can get at the best price, whatever good, right? So I don't know, do you guys have any other examples of industries where there are homogeneous goods? I have one that I often bring up, and students sometimes push back on me. But if you think about you're buying just on the basis of price, anybody have an idea? Okay, what about you, Richard? You're here. What do you think?
Excuse me?
Yeah, so if you can you think of any goods that you purchase just on the basis of price? Like, it doesn't matter who's making it, what, let's say, where it's coming from. You just want the lowest price you can get.
Like gas?
Yeah, so that's the one that I use. Now, does anybody see a problem with that? What do people sometimes say to me?
I mean, there is slight differences among gas, but like even me who kind of knows a good amount about the different types of gas. I know some places like Chevron has their Techron, so it's not really the same. But
it makes the cars
in reality, no, it doesn't. It's the same stuff.
But I see on the commercials,
that's a marketing gimmick.
Happy cars, and then they have the dogs, and the dogs are so happy too.
Yeah, no, they're all the same.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I get pushback on. Sometimes people say, like, no. Like, yeah, I buy on the basis of price, but I don't buy Arco gas.
How come?
Well, you would have to probably go in some thread on Reddit and read for pages to find out but what I've heard students say, and at Cal Poly, maybe there's a little bit of evidence because we have an engineering program, and there are probably some chemical engineers that are in the room sometimes. But anyway, the claim that I've heard is that the way that Arco refines their gas, it's just not quite as good as the other ones. You have to, again, forgive me, I'm not a chemical engineer and I don't know why they would say that, but I've heard that repeatedly. And so anyway, I don't buy Arco gas, not because of that. It's just it's not the closest station for me. I'm looking for convenience too. But and I don't like how they always want to charge you a fee whenever you don't use cash. That is so annoying. But yeah, I mean, for me, gas represents a homogeneous good. It's something that I just buy on the basis of price. I don't care whether it's a Texaco gas station or a Chevron gas station or whatever. I actually buy most of my gas at Ralph's. So yeah, I don't care. So, but when you start to talk about goods where brands become important, right? Then okay, now so like let's look at this first question. Which one do you think is the best one that's an example of a monopolistically competitive industry? So if you did reading and things like that in your book and other places, so monopolistic competition is when firms try to do things intentionally to make their product distinctive and hopefully better. But what they're really trying to do is get a loyal customer base. And they don't want just a loyalty for sales. They want the loyalty so they can raise the price and their customers won't run away. So if you look at these industries, okay, Matt, are you with us?
Yeah,
I want to answer.
Okay, well, we'll do one at a time. So when you think about,
phone.
well, wait a minute. So for soybeans, right? Do you think that sounds like, do you care about your soybean brand when you go for edamame or whatever? Because that's soybeans.
No.
Well, Matt, what about you? What do you?
definitely not. Especially since there's probably a lot of brands if you really looked around.
Yeah.
And then-
Okay. So then we'll talk to Beverly. Okay. So you were saying cell phones. Do you buy on the basis of price, like Cricket? You don't care whoever, or are you looking for a brand, a cell phone provider?
The brand. Well, I know
Oh.
it's trying to push out the competition.
Well, yeah, but do you? Because this is from the consumer's perspective, right? Do you think
Yeah.
that their branding is effective? Like, are you willing to pay more to be a T-Mobile customer, for example? Are you like T-Mobile first? That's the best one.
Oh no, I'm Verizon. They're the best.
Okay, but you're
Yeah, I
you
mean,
thi-
I'll chime in and say for cell phone services, for me,
Yeah.
I don't think the goods at all are equal to be compared. You know what I mean? Because like where I
okay.
live, I'm in the Santa Cruz Mountain, and you won't find anybody with AT&T because you just don't get signal there. But Verizon, I guess, put up enough towers that they can service the area.
Yeah,
So
yeah. That's
I
Yes,
don't
like
you're
it
really
for
right,
a
feel
lot
Dean.
like
a lot of people too. But see, in that case, right, you're not really basing it on the brand exactly, right? It's more the quality of the service, right? I
well,
mean, if
yeah,
T-Mobile,
that's why I
yeah,
feel like that's not a equal good. Like that's why I feel
yeah,
like for our version of economics, where you assume where, we always make the assumption, hey, the goods are equal,
yeah, exactly. It's not
that
like a
doesn't apply
cucumber.
at all here. Because I mean, and you could say, well, that's not true for everywhere, but like At least for
Right.
anybody who grew up where I did, that's been true forever across my lifespan. I know
Okay.
if I want
Now,
signal in Scotts Valley, my only choice is really Verizon.
okay. And notice the question is which is most likely to be, right?
Yeah.
So what about, so we said soybeans for sure, no. Cell phone sounds like, well, it's wishy-washy, right? We're convinced that brands may have something to do with it, but also there's differences between the quality of the service, so it's hard to compare the brands.
Yeah.
And what about baseball?
I don't even understand what baseball
No.
means.
Yeah, well, because you
The,
don't know if it's baseballs, right?
the baseball bat or the baseball
Or is
whatever.
it like baseball
The
team?
team. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, I think like teams are trying to do branding for sure, right? But I don't know how that affects, because you don't really like charge a price for a baseball team loyalty, right? You might be in California and be a Red Sox fan. That's me. and I hardly ever get the chance to go to any of their games, so it's not sure what does that mean. So
The
okay,
Red Sox twice.
what about overnight delivery? So
FedEx.
like FedEx versus the postal service
UPS.
versus UPS. Do you really care
DHL.
about the brand, or are you more shopping for the service? I think yeah, I don't know. That doesn't strike me. Now, okay, here's the last one. I don't know. What about breakfast cereal?
I don't even eat cereal.
Yeah, I don't know. That
Do you
one I
guys
feel
have?
like a little weird because
Well, are breakfast cereals largely the same?
no.
No, right? There's lots of different like Captain Crunch and Cocoa
Uh,
Puffs
yeah.
and Frosted
Cheerios.
Flakes, Cheerios, there's like lots of different ones. Yeah.
What's the
So
title?
and so for breakfast cereal, I think that's where anyway, that's the one that I'm gonna guess. And it's not because the other ones couldn't be, and it's not, and if you paid attention to things that we've read and whatever. So I think cell phone service counts as there's an example in the lecture about cell phone service providers. I think it's in one of the video lectures that I give, and those are normally seen as oligopolies, which, remember, they're only like a couple, right? And it's kind of hard to know that, but it turns out that even when you get to like Cricket Wireless and things like that, they're just like a cover for like the Verizon network.
Well, yeah, they pay to use the towers. Is
Yeah.
basically how it works.
Yeah, so they're not even really a service provider. They're just contracting with a service provider on your behalf, so you get worse service and you get it cheaper, that kind of thing, depending on where you are, right?
Well, I think part of the way it's done is that when the reason why the service is sometimes worse is that when the tower gets, let's say, like saturated, it can only move so much data at once. The first people it starts to throttle are not going to be, AT&T's main customers. It's going to be everyone, like Cricket, who uses their towers.
Yeah, exactly. So, or Boost.
Yes, or Boost.
Boost gets boosted, right? They get kicked off, booted.
Yeah.
So and then overnight delivery, there are only a few companies too, right?
Yes.
So, and baseball, like we said, we can't really buy. Well, anyway, I'm guessing breakfast cereal. Let's see. You guys see this? Yeah, breakfast cereal. And so, what do you know? Like, your book will tell you that, and lectures will tell you that in a monopolistically competitive industry, like brand is super important, and that a lot of the costs associated with the business are in maintaining and advertising its brand. So The reason why I like monopolistic competition is that I think that if you look at it carefully, you'll notice that it seems like a lot of things that we buy on a day-to-day basis are produced by monopolistically competitive industries. Breakfast cereal is just one example, but the other one that I like to talk about is like jeans. Normally people have a favorite brand. You know, it used to be Levi's was the big thing, and then, you know, people, I don't know if you guys have a favorite jean brand, but anytime that you're, you know, willing to pay more for something, just because it's got a label on it, then you know you're talking about a monopolistically competitive industry. If and now I know it's probably true, like my daughters, they like Vans shoes, the slip-ons mostly. But you can buy something that looks just like a Vans slip-on. Maybe the quality is a little bit different, depending upon who's making it. But for some reason, you know, they feel like being in Vans is important to them. So, you know, we pay extra for that. So whenever you're into that kind of a thing, then you know that the industry is monopolistically competitive. And then these other questions just go and tell us or ask us about, okay, what, you know, what are the issues that we find with monopolistically competitive industries that we don't find in other, you know, industries. And so the opposite of having products that are largely the same or homogeneous are differentiated products. And yeah, monopolistic competition is characterized by differentiated products. They do advertising. It turns out, again, if you do your reading, you listen to the lecture, that in the long run, it's like a competitive industry because basically their advertising and branding expenses eat up their profits. So you might think that, oh, well, if Vans is producing the same shoe as, you know, or a shoe that's very similar to, you know, something I can get at Costco that's just, you know, nameless brand, whatever, then isn't Vans, like, aren't they making lots of money? Well, it turns out that in most of these monopolistically competitive industries, you don't see really high profitability because the extra money you're paying for the shoe is really going to advertise. You know, when you see Vans out at skate parks and they do their slick ads and stuff like that, that's a cost. And so if you look at the product and you start to break apart, you know, why is this thing more expensive? And then you find out that it's not really because they have some, you know, really high production costs because they're doing something that's super high quality. For the most part, and some of it, brand name products have a brand to maintain, and part of the loyalty has to do with the idea that the customers expect a certain quality. So there's good reason to think that if you buy Vans, yeah, it might be a higher quality shoe than a generic that looks similar. But most of what cuts into their profits that doesn't in a competitive industry. I mean, nobody advertises for cucumbers, right? I mean, you might see an ad in the Ralph's grocery store circular, but it's not that they're advertising cucumbers like for you want to buy cucumbers or something like that. It's just they'll just list the price that they're selling that week. And really, those grocery stores aren't selling the product, they're selling their service as a retail provider. So they want to let you know, oh, we have this product and we have it at a good price. And they're not saying, oh, you know, these are the best cucumbers in the world, comes to Ralph's and, you know, we'll charge you whatever we charge you. And so anyway, it turns out that monopolistic competitive industries aren't, super profitable as you might think. You might think like, oh, like Gucci brands, right? It has to be Gucci's making tons of money. Well, again, in general, no, that's not true. They're not a super high rate of return industry. And then they have these downward sloping marginal revenue curves like a monopoly. So they're like a competition in the long run. In the short run, they're like a monopoly. And so here the answer is also 5. It's going to be all of the above. Okay. So again, if you read a little bit more about this and watch the lecture, you'll see that there are certain other features of monopolistic competition, and then you should be able to answer that. And also it's on a practice, so it's no big deal. The main thing I wanted to talk about was the idea of Nash equilibrium, the prisoner's dilemma, and how to answer these questions that are on, not on monopolistic competition, but on this other form of industrial organization or organization of industries, which is called oligopoly. And it's what we talked about before when we said, oh, cell phone providers, there are only a few of them. Well, it turns out you have monopoly, which means one producer. And we know that if there's just one producer, there tends to be low output in the industry and high prices, and there's deadweight loss. Well, in oligopoly, it's not monopoly because there's more than one, but oligopoly, oligy means few in Latin. So it's not mono, it's oligy. So oligopoly has a few competitors. And because of that, it ends up to be the case that there are these deviations from competitive behavior. Remember, the main prediction of competition is that the price in the industry will be equal to marginal cost. So competition is about this P is equal to MC. That's competition. But when you get to monopoly and oligopoly, that's not true anymore. Prices differ from just charging the cost of production. So how do we answer these types of questions? Well, notice here that if we read this prompt really quickly, so there are two firms, A and B, in this small market, small town for market for bottled water in a small town. If they each produce 25 bottles, then each earns a profit of 500. However, if one produces 50 and the other produces only 25, then they have profits of 750 and 150 respectively. If they both produce $50, profits drop to $200 each. Which of these outcomes is a cartel outcome? And so in order to figure this out, the idea in oligopoly is that because there are just a couple of firms, they have two strategies available to them. One strategy is to band together and to behave like a monopolist. And so you might have heard this. It's illegal, but it's just been illegal. And again, if you read your text and you read and you watch the lectures, then there are two what are called antitrust acts. There's the Clayton Act and the Sherman Act, which were passed in the early 20th century. So early to mid 1900s. And I think maybe actually like the Clayton Act might have been like from 1890. But at that time, what was happening is there were some really important industries like steel and oil, where there were just a couple of producers at the time. And the steel producers, for example, were getting together and they were price fixing. So they were making agreements with one another to charge a certain price for steel. And that gave them this monopoly advantage in the market. And so they weren't competing with each other. And so the reason why we end up talking about this in the context of Nash Equilibrium is that before the Clayton and the Sherman antitrust acts were passed, the competitors in a small industry could actually legally write contracts with one another and say, for example, okay, Mitchell, I agree that we're going to charge $2,000 for a ton of steel, right? And your company is going to agree to that too, and we're going to both sign a contract. And then if you try to compete with me by lowering your price, I'll sue you and take you to court, and the judge can enforce the contract, and they can make you pay monetary damages to me for you charging a lower price and stealing some of my customers away by doing that, because that's how competition works, right? If it's real competition, then people are buying on the basis of price. So whoever charges the lowest price is going to get the most customers, and that's why price ends up being equal to marginal cost, because everybody in the industry is competing on the basis of price, and at the end they end up charging just enough to cover their costs of production. That's good for consumers, and we also found out, because total surplus is maximized under competition, that it's also good for society, right? But it is, from a producer's point of view, they would much rather have a monopoly outcome where most of the benefits go to them. So once the Clayton and Sherman antitrust acts were passed, their main function was to make those types of contracts, and they were called trust agreements. That's why they're called antitrust acts, to make those types of contracts for price fixing illegal. So now, if companies get caught engaging in price fixing, then they can go to jail. And there are even some famous cases from like the 1980s where there were airline executives who were talking about price fixing, and there were witnesses, and the CEO of a big airline ended up going to jail, to prison, because he talked about, conspired, right, to price fix with another executive from another airline company. So it's serious business, and the government really doesn't want price fixing, especially in these small industries. So you might say, well, it's illegal, so it just won't happen. But you probably know that in economics, it's all about costs and benefits. So really what's going on is, right, if you do manage to price fix but you don't get caught, then you can make good money, right? So what we're interested in is what are called unenforceable agreements, or people call that it collusion, or they call it tacit collusion. Tacit meaning that it's kind of secret, right? And so, because a lot of people have wondered, and if again you troll around on Reddit or the internet, you might find that people are suspicious about oil companies, and they'll say things like, well, I notice every time Chevron raises its price by a dime, then Texaco across the street raises their price by a dime. So it looks like they're price matching each other, right? Like they're price fixing.
Yeah, they
And
do that.
yeah. And so a lot of people complain, like, well, how come they're not being taken to court for doing that? It doesn't seem like they're competing with each other. And the only thing I'll say about that is just that it's difficult to prove if you don't have like a smoking gun, right? If you don't have a witness that says, I saw the executive at this company talking to this person, and I'll go to court and testify to it, or you don't have like a contract or something written, right, that is clearly illegal. So economists are concerned, and have been concerned for a long time, about this issue of, well, how can we detect when small industries with just a few firms might collude and behave like a monopolist, and we call that a cartel outcome when they act like a monopolist. And what's it going to look like when they do compete with each other? Because they'll still have some market power. That means the ability to raise price above marginal cost, because there are only a few of them in the industry. And so that, issue was, outstanding, meaning that it was an unsolved issue of research, and still is today to some extent, but most of it has been largely resolved by the introduction of game theory and the Nash Equilibrium. And that's a game solution concept that was developed by a mathematician named John Forbes Nash. And he's very famous, and he won a Nobel Prize. And there's even a movie about him. I don't know if you all have seen it. It's actually a pretty good movie. It has Russell Crowe in it, and it's called A Beautiful Mind. But so whenever we see these types of problems, then what you should do first is you should get out a piece of paper, and I'll show you what I do, and you should draw a little table. And so I will new share. Here's my whiteboard. And this table has what you might call, like a fancy name. It's called a game matrix. But the standard one that is used in these introductory courses is just a 2x2 table. It's a special case of oligopoly that we call duopoly, because do is in duo, it means just two. And so you divide it into a little table here with 4 cells. And then typically, and it doesn't matter which one you label which way, but you normally label the top one, and it could be either of the parties in the example, the column player, and you'll see why it's the column player. So a lot of times I just call the column player Colin, but in your example, you can call them whoever you want. Normally these end up being something like AT&T versus Verizon, and so AT&T is one player and the other one is Verizon. And then over here, and maybe I'll do this in red, you have the row player. And guess what I call the row player generically? Anybody? Rowan.
Rower.
That's a name too, right? So Rowan, yeah. And so these are symmetric games, which means that both players have the same actions available to them, and the actions that they can take are the labels for the columns and the rows respectively. So for example, column 1 would be the first action available to Colin. And normally, because we're interested in this issue of are they going to cooperate or not, then we just normally say that the first action is, and I want to change the color here so it's consistent, is the cooperative action, whatever that is. It's fixing prices, it's limiting quantities, but it's just behaving cooperatively, which means in this context, behaving like you're part of a monopoly, right? A monopolist does everything. If these guys or girls are colluding to act like a monopolist, then they're colluding or cooperating with each other. They're doing something to help each other out, right? So that's the cooperative play or the cooperative action. And then the other one is the uncooperative choice, which would be like to compete, because we already have C, we don't use C with each other, but instead we use the word defect and say they're defecting from cooperation, which means that they're competing with each other. So we'll just call that action D for defect, right? Which means acting like a competitor, not helping the other player. And then likewise, again, like I'd mentioned before, the exact same actions are available to the row player. Okay, and I just want to straighten these out a little bit. Okay. Okay. And then we begin listing payoffs, okay? So you'll notice that each one of these cells represents a combination of actions, right? So these are different outcomes. Once each of the players chooses an action, then the results of the game are determined. So for example, this cell is going to be C, and I can't do it in different colors. Well, I guess I could, but it would take a long time. So I'm just going to do them all in black. So this would be like C and C, they both play cooperation. This is where the row player is playing cooperation. So maybe I should use a color here just to be clear. This is where the row player is playing C, and the column player is playing D. Okay, and then down here you would have right, the row player is playing D, and the column player is playing C, and then the last one is D for the row player, and C for, or sorry, and D for the column player too. Okay. So, and I'm gonna fix this up just a little bit because there's something that I think will be easier to show this way. Okay, so let me try to fix these up a little bit. Okay. Okay, and so with each of these action combinations, there's a set of payoffs that occur. And if you go back to the Ignithium example that we were talking about just a moment ago, then you'll see that what you have to do is you have to say, okay, it's saying under this circumstance, are they cooperating? What are the payoffs? And so then you can fill in this matrix, right? And then that's your step one for solving the problem. Now, I'll give you guys a little hint. So normally what people do when they're going to begin filling out these game matrices, you know, a game matrix like this one is table, is they'll move the label for the payoff to the column player to the top. So it's like closer. It's just to try to get your eyes to go in the right place so you can remember. Because we normally, right, don't carry around two different colored pens. And then they'll move the label for the row player back over toward the direction of the row player, like that. Okay. And let's see. Okay. So that's pretty good. So these are the action combinations and their outcomes. So for example, if Colin plays cooperate and Rowan plays cooperate, then they're behaving like a monopoly, and they would split monopoly profits. That would be their payoff. And if Rowan is cooperating, he's holding up a high price, right? But Colin is defecting, which means he's competing against Rowan, and he's charging a slightly lower price, and he's stealing all the customers. So Colin gets a lot of profit, and Rowan doesn't get much, right? And then the opposite situation down here, where Rowan is defecting, he's getting a bunch of profit, and Colin's trying to be helpful to Rowan, but he's really, as a result of that, losing a lot of money. And this is the competitive outcome where they're both defecting, right? And I also want to point out one thing, because this kind of fools students, right? So when the players are cooperating, they're acting like a monopolist. So which one of these is the monopoly outcome? Anybody want to help me with that? Mitchell, you want to help me? Oh, did I lose you, Mitchell?
No, I'm a little confused by this whole thing. I think I'm gonna have to read the book, because are Colin and Rowan, are those just two different competitors? Like,
yeah, well, there's two different players.
Yeah, two different players. And then what exactly does C and D stand for? I guess that's what I must have missed.
Yeah. I said C stands for the cooperative action.
Oh, okay. Well, then if they're both cooperating,
and D stands for defect, which means not to cooperate.
Yeah. So if they're both cooperating, it's that top left quadrant.
Yeah. So like this one over here looks like the cooperative outcome, right?
Yeah.
I had to put a little X in it, right? But what messes students up is that it's only because, right, we have labeled the box the way we did. There's nothing prevents me from switching the labels on the columns, right? As long as I switch everything with it. So when you set these up yourself, if you put cooperation over here and defect over here, then all of a sudden your cooperative outcome will be down here instead.
Yeah, it's a bit like I don't know if there's any biology majors, but it's a bit like the Pundit squares, I think is what it's called for. Just something similar.
Maybe. So my whole point is just be careful when you construct your matrix, that you look at what's actually the action being played. Don't always just assume that, cooperation or the monopoly outcome's always going to be in the upper left hand, because it's only there because of the way that we constructed this particular example. It could have just as easily been down here if we had used different labels, right? So what matters is what the players are doing, not what box we're talking about. You know, it's not always like the upper left hand box, right? So and then so we said the one where they are both cooperating is the monopoly outcome. The one where they're both defecting down here is called the Nash Equilibrium. Okay. And so the Nash Equilibrium is a prediction that in this type of a setting that the players will in equilibrium, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but they will choose the strategy defect. And the reason it's so interesting is that initially it's counterintuitive, because what you're going to see is that the cooperative outcome gives them more profit. They get higher payoffs. They're better off. Nevertheless, they end up still playing the uncooperative strategy, or they still end up playing defect. And that's kind of a surprise unless you follow the logic that I'm going to tell you, working your way through these game matrices, using the assumptions that Nash did when he came up with this prediction that the players will most likely defect, which, if you'll note, that even though it's bad for the players, from an industry point of view, it's better, because it means more output for consumers and lower prices. It means something closer to competition than the monopoly outcome. Okay, so let's go ahead and you know, fill this in. And so I'll move my spotlight over here. And okay, so let's look at the first problem from the example on Ignition. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy all of this and take it over to our whiteboard, because we'll need to refer to it, and I will paste it up here. Okay. Okay. So hopefully try to position it a little bit better.
It would be better if you place it to the right.
Well, I think it's okay. I just think that I gotta move it a little bit over here. Okay, so you guys can all see it then, right?
Yes.
And I'll do the spotlight and put it here. Okay. So how do we begin to fill this out? Well, I got to move all this stuff around my screen so I can see. Okay, so we have these two firms, A and B. So we just have to choose, okay, you know, who we want to be what. So I'll say, okay, I'm going to let the column player well, maybe it's a little bit more. Okay, and then I'll move this this label down a little bit. Okay, so I'm gonna let the column player be one of the players. He's gonna be player A. Okay, and then I've gotta let the other player be the row player, so he'll be player B, right? So I could say firm A and firm B, but I'm just sticking with the idea of players. But if you guys are confused, just let me know. And then it says, okay, they each produce 25 bottles. So you can see their actions. They can either produce 25 bottles or 50 bottles, right? So those are the only two actions available to them, right? So if they produce 25 bottles, let's say, okay, if they both produce, blah, 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 the first one. If they each produce 25 bottles, then each earns a profit of 500. Well, to let you know, right, remember the way that monopolists earn profits is they hold back supply and drive up the price. So in this case, right, the monopolist choice that they're talking about would be the action of choosing to produce only 25 bottles each. And then their payoffs are 500 and 500 respectively, right? And then, so that was this first part here, right? If they each produce 25 bottles, then they each get a profit of 500. That's their payoff. If one produces 50, so this is the other alternative, right? So the defect strategy or the defect action is to produce 50 bottles. And you can think of you know, if you want to try to again connect this with, you know, your intuition, then you could say, oh, well, like overproduction, you know, and again, I'm just putting quotes around it because it's something better for consumers. It's, you know, good for competition to produce more, is like flooding the market, right, and driving down the price. And you'll see that kind of language in both your book and in you know, the lecture. So the other outcome is if one produces 50 while the other produces only 25. So now we're starting to talk about, okay, look at this outcome. If player A produces 25 while player B produces 50, then what happens to the profits? Well, then the profit of each is 750 and 150 respectively. So the person that's producing the 50 bottles, right, is able to fetch a higher profit by doing that if the other person is holding their production down. So anyway, I'll go ahead and fill in this. So this would be 750. And this would be 150. And then the defect is if they both produce 50, so 50 and 50, then the profits drop to 200 each. So here, if they're stuck in defect, then they both only get $200. And here. And then obviously, or maybe not obviously, but here, this situation where A is the one that's producing the 50, then that's when A makes the big profit and player B is only making 150. Okay. So again, this is going to be the Nash equilibrium down here where they're both overproducing, right? Or, producing much more and getting lower profits. And then notice this cooperative outcome where they behave like a monopolist, that's what's really best for them, right? Because they're both making more profit, right? And here in between, if you add up their two profits, 750 plus 150, it's a total of 900. So here they get a total of 1,000. Here they get a total of 900. And here they only get a total of 400. So they're worse, the worst off. So like you ask yourself, well, why would they end up down here? And this is the logic of Nash equilibrium that I'm going to explain why it is the Nash equilibrium is the correct prediction in this kind of a situation. Okay, so okay, so the way that Nash thought about it is he said, okay, well, how am I going to figure out how these players are going to play? Well, I'm going to take each one of them and have them consider what the other player would do and then choose their best response. So that's really the key to the Nash equilibrium, is that each player chooses their best response to what the other player does. So I'll ask you to play along, Mitchell. Okay, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
So suppose that player A chooses 25, right? So we're stuck in this column, right?
Yeah.
What is the best thing for player B to do? Should player B choose to produce 25, or should they choose to produce 50?
They should choose to produce 50.
Yeah,
because that
right.
maximizes it.
That maximizes their profits, right? And now consider the other situation, right? And so now suppose we're stuck in this column, and then you say, okay, should they choose to produce 25 or should they choose to produce 50? Well, you say that's a choice between this and that, which is better.
Well, 50 again is better.
Yeah, they get a higher profit, right?
Yeah.
So it turns out that, and we call it a dominant strategy, and this is probably the answer to one of your questions in your book. Or in your homework, is that the player B's dominant strategy is to always defect, right? Now, what about player A? Well, we know the situation is symmetric, so we shouldn't expect anything any different, but let's go ahead and just look at the choices. Suppose that B chooses to produce 25, then that means that player A can choose between this and that. Well, which is better? Mitchell?
The 750 is better.
Yeah, and if player B chooses 50, again, we ask, what's better for player A?
The 200.
Yeah. So the point is that, and this is what they say in your book and I say in the lecture, is that both players have this dominant strategy to behave in a non-cooperative way, and because of that, we end up with this. I'm trying to make my diagram nice. We end up with this defect Nash equilibrium. And again, to a lot of people, it's confusing because clearly the players are worse off here. The businesses are making lower profits here than they would if they cooperated with one another. But there's this element of trust, right? And remember that they can't just contract with each other to play the monopoly outcome because that's illegal. So tacit collusion means that you have to say, like, player A has to go to player B and say, okay, I'm only going to produce 25 bottles. Are you in? And then player B has to say yes, but that is not a sustainable thing without some punishment, right? Because if player B doesn't behave in the way that he said he would or she would, if instead they produce more, they get a higher profit, right? And it's this dynamic that forces them to play the Nash Equilibrium. So anyway, cartel outcome is the cooperative, okay? The non-cooperative outcome is the Nash Equilibrium. I think I've said everything that I need to say for you guys to be able to finish this up yourself. But just remember that you need to draw a diagram like this and fill it in order for you to work through the problem. So that's the main advice I'm giving. Okay. So I'm stopping, and I'm gonna stop